Hi.
Hi there.
How's it
Hi,
going?
Claudio.
Come on in.
Thank you for showing us around.
No problem. Happy to have you all here, and happy to have you specifically here, Millie.
Okay, so we're having a little studio visit, and you're going to show us your space, and we're going to have a chat
Yeah.
about photo, life. So first, tell me a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Claudio Nolasco. I'm the new assistant. I'm a new assistant professor of photography here at the University of Miami, and I'm also the area head for photography and electronic media. In terms of my background, I guess it's to say I've been working in photography for about 20 years now. What you're seeing here is my studio, and I have a number of projects up that I figured I would show, and some of which will help me kind of tell a little bit of the story of my background. I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, but I grew up in New York City, and a number of my projects are actually based there. I went to undergrad at the Cooper School of Art, and I got my master's degree at Columbia University. From there, I've kind of moved around the country for the last couple of years, working on a number of different institutions, and now I'm here at the University of Miami.
Now, this is your second semester, right,
Yes.
with us. So how are you liking the department?
The department's great. The folks that I'm working with are really fun. The students have been really, really interesting, and I'm getting used to the setup in terms of photography here and the conversations around photography here. But in terms of the department itself, I mean, I couldn't be happier. It's been a really, really smooth transition.
Awesome. Can you show us around a little?
Sure. So this is my studio as it is right now. And what you're seeing, if you kind of scan around the room, is I have some of the projects that I'm working on right now. Some older projects here that I'm re-editing, projects that were previously in book form. Now I'm sort of re-editing one for the wall, but also re-editing the books themselves. And then these are newer works in color that I'm editing now from about 2 years worth of photographs that I've taken. And then in the middle here, I have some, let's call them tests, with some new camera equipment and some new things that I'm working on, also in color and also digital. I should say for a really long time, I was working exclusively in film, or using film to shoot black and white, and using analog processes, and then bringing those in through the computer to make digital prints. But now I've kind of switched to color, and it makes a lot of sense to have a completely kind of digital workflow. And so I've been using, digital cameras and digital printing and digital editing the entire way through for about the last 2.5 years.
Now, what does a typical workday look like for you?
You mean
In general?
In general, as a professor or as a photographer?
Well, as a photographer.
Okay, so it sort of depends. My work is related to the documentary genre, right? So it gets a little more complicated because it's not documentary in the sort of strictest sense, but it is photography of and in the real world, right? So in terms of like what a normal day looks like, it depends on what I'm trying to do that day. So often, depending on the project, a normal day for me begins early, and I might, so let me specify it this way. If I'm working on something very specific, then obviously I travel to where I need to be, I go and speak to people, and then I start making photographs. And depending on what that project is, I might have a particular methodology. I get there, I start talking to people, I bring out the camera, maybe I make pictures before I speak to anyone around a particular neighborhood or something like that. In other times, like right now with these images that I'm making now that are more kind of like me learning some of the equipment, but also kind of getting to know Miami because I'm not from here. A typical day might start, either early morning or late afternoon. I grab my camera equipment, and I go out and I kind of let things speak to me, things that I see, and I make images randomly. There's something about the intuitive way of making pictures that kind of helps you understand where you are, and then also helps you understand as you start to look at pictures later, what you are interested in or what is starting to catch your eye. And so that's a question of like what the project needs, right? So for some projects I do research and I start with research. For other projects, they begin basically in exploration. I start to look around, I start to make pictures, I start to talk to people, I make pictures of them. I get a sense of maybe what's going on in the neighborhood in terms of the people or the whatever the interest might be, either cultural or economic or political, and I make pictures that way. So it sort of depends on what the starting point is. And then some days are days where it's about editing and printing. And so then there's a sense of kind of looking at pictures and putting things next to each other to see whether or not some kind of new meaning is being made. Sometimes it's about kind of figuring out what the picture should look like. So it's not, I guess I should say, it really does depend on the needs of the project, and then specifically whether or not I'm at a stage where I need to start looking at prints, and I need to start looking at individual images. And I work in books, so I guess I should have said that earlier, but a lot of my projects end up as a book. And so there are certainly times, and it wouldn't be a typical day, it might be a typical month or more, where what I'm really doing is kind of studying and analyzing my pictures and analyzing what the images are saying, right? And then from that, I can start putting together a kind of narrative that ends up becoming the book.
Now, is there a ritual that you do in the studio? Do you listen to music? Do podcasts?
I listen to a lot of political podcasts. So I listen to, there's a great podcast from a station that I used to listen to in upstate New York called WAMC, and it's called The Round Table, and it's this sort of great group of sort of New York intellectuals from a lot of the local colleges that get together and to talk politics. So I still listen to that. It's part of my ritual to listen to them about once a day. I listen to some music podcasts. So like right now I'm listening to a podcast on the history of punk rock, right? So, and then music plays a part, especially when I'm editing the books. Like I want to listen to music because it lets me kind of like stop thinking. It just lets me, part of my brain focus on the music, and then part of my brain focus on the images so that I can kind of move them around.
Yeah.
It's not usually quiet in my studio, right? There's usually something going on to distract me.
Well, awesome. Let's sit down and have a chat then.
Sure.
Because I definitely have more questions for you.
Of course.
So, I have to ask about the pandemic.
Okay.
How was it for you? I mean, did it change? I mean, obviously it had an impact on everyone, especially in the art world and artists. How were you able to maintain and stay creative and do projects, and how was your experience?
So one of the things so as I mentioned, a lot of the work that I do happens when I kind of go out on the street, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the work begins there and ends there, right? It's kind of walking around, getting to know places, getting to know people, having conversations, learning from those interactions. And so the pandemic has obviously made that very, very difficult, and especially here in South Miami with how much the transmission rate is for COVID, it's made it a sort of a risky proposition. And so in some ways, that has really made for some difficulties in terms of sustaining the same kind of practice that I would have had pre-pandemic, and spending the same amount of time kind of interacting with people and going in and out of places. That being said, I think in a good way, it also has allowed me to slow down. And normally I tend to work on a number of projects at the same time. You sort of hedging your bets to see what sticks. And so at any time I might be working at two or three or four projects, depending on what's going on. And I might be traveling to one place to make a certain kind of picture and staying put for other ones, or writing, or doing anything else. And so because of that, the pandemic has kind of chilled all that out. And instead, for the last, certainly for the last 6 months, what I've been spending a lot of time on is kind of revisiting these long-term projects that I have finished and that maybe I have made kind of book dummies or maquettes with the idea of publishing them, but I've started to revisit them because I realized that now I have this time to kind of give them their due in a way that maybe before since I was moving in a bunch of different projects, I couldn't or didn't want to. And so that's been really interesting over the last 6 months, is again sort of revisiting these larger projects and seeing what kind of changes I can make to refine them. Do I need to restart them? Is there something interesting in them? I've also started to look, so with these pictures that are here on this wall, these color images, a lot of these pictures were kind of orphan images. You know, I try to shoot every day. It's kind of compulsive in terms of that making, but so a lot of images don't necessarily mean any, or don't have a specific reason. They're just kind of interesting to me. They're moments that catch my eye. They're interactions that are kind of beautiful or telling, but they maybe don't necessarily make it into a particular project. And so what I've been doing also over the last 6 months is revisiting those archives of images that I have, and starting to recognize, you know, certain, let's say, motifs in the work, or certain ideas that are part of the work, some of it more personal or more poetic, as opposed to maybe more documentary. And so what I've been doing lately is making a lot of prints. So this is a stack of digital images. I forget, there's something about like 600, maybe 500, 600 pictures in here. Maybe a little less now that I probably have edited some of them out in this particular stack. And so I'm starting to look at these orphan images and starting to think about, well, whether or not I can connect them in some way, right? They happen to be diaristic images. They're of my everyday life, you know, all the things that I was sort of doing, the people that I'm with, right? You know, sort of these slower moments where I'm trying to make, when I'm trying to capture something kind of interesting or beautiful about the light or the people that are with me. But they're not necessarily like pictures that I had preconceived or had some particular project for. And so now I'm looking at these pictures as a kind of interesting personal document, and I'm starting to put them together as the possibility for a different kind of book, right? Like something that doesn't have the same, let's say, pointed narrative that some of the work that I did in Brooklyn that was about gentrification and economics is, but it's a little bit quieter, a little bit more introspective, a little bit more personal. And so that's what I've been doing lately, and mostly it's kind of revisiting projects, re-editing things, and then looking at my archive of images to see things that maybe I have missed that have a lot of potential. So again, in one way, it's been really, really hard, right? Because I really enjoy going out there. I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy kind of seeing what the world has to offer and figuring out projects that way. But on the other hand, it's also let me take a moment to revisit that work that I had already done, but which I had kind of put aside for more specific ideas that I was working on. And that's, you know, that part of it has been interesting and fun and generative. So I think over the last 6 months, I've edited 3 books already. And now I'm re-editing 2 other ones. And then I have this one, which is going to be the next book, which I'm holding in front of me. And I hope to kind of put that together.
So tell us about your love for photo books. Is it your preferred vehicle to present work? Is it just an instrument, or is it that's how you use in terms of storytelling?
So it is the preferred vehicle for the work. And the thing about it is that I think of the photo book as a really particularly important container for the way that I envision the project working. So I guess what I should say is that there's something very different between, let's say, a catalog of images and a photo book. And a photo book functions on a very different level than just a kind of catalog of a particular group of images that may or may not be interrelated. For me, the photo book affords really particular opportunities for the creation of narrative in a visual way, right? And so eventually it is the artwork, the images in and of themselves. So Lincoln Kirstein has this great line about when he was talking about Walker Evans's American Photographs. he says that the images lose their individual sense and then become together as a totality, a larger kind of holistic. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. And that aspect of the way that photography can function, not as an individual image, but as a group of images that tells a bigger story and kind of holds a larger sense of reality or of the world, is fascinating to me. And it's the way that I think about all my projects. So I don't think about individual pictures so much as I think about how they fit with other pictures. And so when I'm editing or when I'm looking at pictures, I almost never have a single photograph that I'm maybe looking at. It's always a photograph in the context of other photographs. Because eventually what happens is that they become a book, right? So when I'm working on something like a photo book, here's one of the ones, right? I go through, so this is, these are images from a series called Seemingly Without Earth, which is part of these black and white photographs that are up here on the wall. And what I do is I start with, this project I've been shooting for about 10 years. And so at a certain point, what I start to do is I start to make prints. Sometimes like this, just to kind of see what the work looks like, right? And to choose out some of the images that are really interesting. But eventually what I do is I make a stack of just sort of crappy little prints like this. For black and white, it was easy because I would just use like a LaserJet printer, like a really inexpensive one. And I would make these stacks of photos, right? And kind of spread them out on the floor and start to make sequences on the wall. And then from those sequences, what ends up happening is those images are then translated into something that roughly kind of equals a book, so that I can, move through the pages and kind of flip pages and see how one image turns into the other. So we go from physical prints up on the wall in sequences to physical prints being kind of glued onto cheaply, so I can also move them around, right? So I can kind of make new senses of them. And then eventually what ends up happening is I make, using a program like InDesign, I end up designing the kind of layout for the book. And I end up making what are called dummies, right? And sometimes I'll make multiple dummies just to kind of change the design, play around with the how the images look. And then eventually, hopefully, I make something like this, which is a more full-size and higher resolution maquette. You can see it's kind of messy because I've been going through it quite a lot lately. And this is a place where I try to get the sense of the quality of the printing, any text or information that I might add to the book in order to make sense. And then it's a much more finished idea of what the sequencing of the book is going to be, right? So this book, for the pictures for this book, as I said, I've been photographing for about 10 years. It's based in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is the neighborhood where I grew up. And that neighborhood has been really drastically changed over the last few years by gentrification. And so I started by photographing sort of everything and everybody in the neighborhood. But the process of editing let me kind of see the story that was really more about the men in the neighborhood, the Latino men in the neighborhood, because they're such a visible part of the neighborhood, the culture that I grew up in, right? So folks hang out at bodegas, or they hang out in front of buildings, and there's memorials, and there's like the graffiti writing and all of the things that kind of tell you something about the culture. But specifically, it was these guys. And, it's a bit of a self-portrait in that way, right? Because I was one of those guys who hung out in the neighborhood and was part of these groups and kind of, was there growing up. And so now the book, as opposed to being a kind of large survey of what was going on in Williamsburg, is this, it becomes a bit more allegorical, and it becomes about these men and this place as it changes. And then the other part of it is, and it started out in the front of the book, I make a connection to Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is based, where the story kind of unfolds, is directly in the same neighborhood where I grew up, like a block away. And so when I read this book, I was doing research about Williamsburg and thinking about the place, right, historically. One of the things that came up was, the tree that grows in Brooklyn is called the tree of heaven. It's a Chinese sumac, which is a weed. And so that tree kind of strangely, I was already photographing that tree in all of these lots where buildings used to be, right? So they had knocked down all these buildings to build condos, and they would let them kind of like be empty for a while, and immediately these trees come up because they're weeds, but then they grow into these gigantic trees. And so I was already photographing these empty lots where buildings had come down and these trees are in them. And when I read that book, it made this really interesting sense, because she talks about these trees as like these sort of hard scrabble, rough things that grow up out of the concrete and that are actually not wanted, right? But that they would be beautiful if there weren't so many of them in a place. I felt that there was this really interesting metaphor between these trees and these men who themselves are kind of like surviving, right, in the neighborhood despite the fact that it's changing and it doesn't want them there. So then there's the documentary aspect of it, right, like photographing the change, the physical change of the neighborhood, right? But then there's also this more poetic and metaphor-rich kind of like connection between the men and these weeds, right? And the things that they get cut down, but they keep coming back, or they eventually are allowed to grow. And so that's where the book becomes really interesting, because it's not just a single image. It's about how all of the images tell a more expansive narrative, which may or may not be fiction in some senses, but that sort of adds to the story of how I present the work.
Now that we're talking about New York, how was your time and your experience at the Cooper Union in Columbia? Because New York is an exciting city. How did it fuel your work?
Well, I grew up there. So I got to New York in 1989 when I was 8 years old. And I grew up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which at the time was a really industrial neighborhood. So it had tons of factories. My mom was a garment worker for all those years. And it was a really rough neighborhood when I was growing up. You know, it was the tail end of the crack epidemic. And there was a sort of bump of heroin that was also being sold. So drug dealing was a big thing. Crime was a big thing in the neighborhood. And so growing up there was a little difficult, as you can imagine, right? Having to kind of watch out and having to be careful and dealing with the kind of realities of a rough neighborhood in New York in the late 80s and early 90s. But slowly it started to change. And as it became more gentrified, it became more... the other side of gentrification was that, of course, it became safer as more money was kind of like injected into the neighborhood. And by the time that was happening, I was already in high school. So I was, going to museums because I was an art student, and I was going to galleries and I was looking at things. And then I got into the Cooper Union, which has a particular reputation and a particular kind of idea of how work functions. That was sort of amazing. In some ways, it was also really difficult too, in terms of like issues with race and class that were kind of played out at the place. But I have nothing but positive things to say. It also gave me a lot of opportunities. I was able to teach there as an undergrad, and I taught once I graduated from there. But the whole time I was making photographs in and around New York City, right? I was a New York City kid kind of making pictures all over the place. And that work was what got me into Columbia University when I went to get my master's degree quite a few years later after I graduated from undergrad. And Columbia, I also have nothing but positive things to say about it. It was a really rigorous program. It was kind of amazing, the artists that I met there and the opportunities to kind of expand the possibilities of my practice. And New York is a hoot, it's like, it's lively, there's so much that you can do. You can cross the street and you're literally in a different country, right? Like in terms of the food and the people that are there, the diversity is kind of amazing. And so all of those things I think played well for me, and it let me kind of like grow intellectually and also personally.
So I heard a podcast that you were in, the Real Photo Show, where they interviewed you.
Yeah.
And you said something really interesting about the role atmosphere plays on photography. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate more on that? And that's maybe your experience in New York? Or... Sure.
So I think when I was in the podcast, I was talking like phenomenologically in terms of like some images that I was making and some things that I was thinking about. So I was editing a book. I was living in New Mexico. So I'm in New York. I get my master's degree. I end up being I ended up running the labs for Pratt Institute, right? And kind of while at the same time I was making photography work. And my wife and I kind of decided that we needed a change, and we decided to move to New Mexico. We moved to New Mexico to Albuquerque. She had a job. I didn't have a job. I figured I would get a teaching job, which never happened, right? So we were there for about a year. And so it was a kind of impromptu residency. And I was making all kinds of work in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, and through Santa Fe. And there's this thing that is really particular about the light in New Mexico. And it has to do with the fact that there's no water, there's very little water vapor in the air since it's a high desert, right? There's a kind of sharpness to it. And then, I talked about coming back east after being there for a year straight, right? And coming back and being kind of surprised by the fact that there's so much water vapor in the air that the atmosphere is palpable, right? You kind of get off the plane and it feels like someone's like blown like mist into your face.
Humidity too.
Right. Literally. I mean, it's like, and the light is very different. And so then there's this aspect so I've been thinking a lot about how, and a lot of my work is about place too. And so I've been thinking a lot about how place kind of creates a sense of, visually, a sense of meaning, right? So the way that light kind of hits things, the way that atmosphere kind of renders the world. And then on top of that, the way that the subject deals with those particulars that have to do with like things like whether environmental or cultural that also have to do with place. So when I'm talking about atmosphere, I mean that both in a climate aspect of it, but I also mean that in terms of also like a kind of social cultural aspect of it. And they're very different depending on where you are. And I think that's part of what I'm dealing with now, is that here is this third place, right? So I lived in New York, New England, which has a very particular kind of atmosphere and culture. Then I went to New Mexico, which is like being on the moon in the best way possible. And now here I am in Miami, which is weirdly a kind of mix of the two. And so I'm learning about what the atmosphere is here, what the realities are here.
Now, do you have a favorite film that you like to use? Or, because I remember the last film I used was the Fuji Natura 1600, which I don't even think they make them anymore.
Yeah,
but
probably not.
I think people like them because it looks vintage. Mm-hmm. And when I was a student, I wanted all my photographs to look like Laurel Canyon in 1960.
Right.
So I was wondering, what are some of your favorites to use, and what?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of film is gone now, right? Yeah. There's very little film left, and the ones that are left are very good. So I guess I should say, when I came out of undergrad, I was doing all color analog process and printing, right? So I was shooting film and doing darkroom color work. After undergrad, already digital was already more than ascendant, right? People were already switching to digital in 2004, 2005, but it was slower, right? It was a slower kind of uptake. At a certain point, access to analog darkrooms was impossible. Even in New York, where people really kind of held on for a long time. And it became very expensive and all those things. So at that point, 2006, 2007, I invested in my first digital camera. And I was shooting color for a long time, and I started making digital prints. I was right at that weird cusp, right before things kind of switched. When I got to grad school, I was making digital color pictures. So some of the work that I showed to get into grad school were these digital color images that I made in Brooklyn. And I should also say that when I was in undergrad, before I started doing photography, I was a painter. Like, I got into college I did photography in college, but I started as a painter. And a lot of the work that I did as a painter was about color, right? Like lots of beautiful color, doing encaustic, like really kind of process heavy, but color specific, not necessarily abstract work, but somewhere in between abstract and figurative. And so the color pictures that I was making for a long time, they were to a large degree about color. They were about a kind of interest in color. So I used to do like hours-long exposure photographs at night using color film. So the color would get super wild, right? Because the exposure, if you didn't correct for reciprocity failures, would, a light that looked white to us would end up looking green or blue or some other color, right? So it was all about this color and then the place. When I was in grad school, I decided that I would revisit Brooklyn, right? And that I would revisit this work that I had been doing in some way, shape, or form for a long time about Williamsburg. And I was shooting color film. I decided to switch back to film because I wanted the higher resolution. And we had a great scanner and we were able to make all these great prints. So I was like, and it was hybrid. So I shot film but scanned it and printed it digitally. And I was shooting film. I got a Mamiya 7 camera, which I don't have here, but I wish I could show it to you guys. But it's like a lightweight 6 by 7 centimeter, big negative kind of camera. And the person that I was working with at Columbia mentioned that that it was really hard for them to see what it was that I was photographing in some of the photographs because they were so much more about color than they were about the subject. And so he challenged me to take a roll of black and white film with me and make pictures. And I tell this story, I'll keep it short, but there was this window at a Puerto Rican barbershop that I always would pass by, like late in the afternoon at golden hour, right? And the light would go right in, and there'd be all these Dominican and Puerto Rican flags in the window, and these beautiful plants that someone had grown, like those money plants, the jade trees, and these aloe things, and big beautiful pots that someone had made by hand. I mean, it was sort of white, and then there were these guys inside who were getting haircuts and this kind of thing, and the light would kind of shine on them. So I would go by this window all the time as I was walking home, and invariably I would pop out the camera and make that picture over and over and over again, or a picture like it. And I went out and had loaded up a roll of black and white film and saw this window, ran over to make the picture that I had been making, that I was sort of obsessed about with this black and white film, and realized, oh wait, I can't make the same picture because it's not color, it's black and white. So then I asked myself, well, if the color is not the point, then what is the point of this picture? And it was a moment of realization that I had been putting all this weight on color. I know this is a long roundabout way to tell you what my favorite film is, but from that moment on, I only shot black and white for about 10 years, for about a decade, and only shot black and white film.
That's a long time. That's
a long time. And so that's to tell you that my favorite film has been Ilford 400. And it's a beautiful film. It has a beautiful kind of grain to it. HP 400 has been my favorite film for about 10 years. And it's been, it has beautiful grain structure. It captures light really beautifully. It's easy to develop. I develop it using this stuff called X-Tall. So it gives me really beautiful sharpness, but also a really beautiful kind of tonal range. And I should say again, because I'm going to embarrass myself, it's Ilford HP5 400 speed is the film that I've been using almost exclusively for 10 years.
Wow.
And then when I decided to go back to color, it was really difficult not to shoot Portra 400 color, which is, I think, an amazing film, fast enough for all the things that you need. But when I started to shoot color film again, I came to the realization that the cost of buying the film, developing the film, scanning the film, and doing all the things that I needed to do for a project that I was working on was so exorbitant that it actually would have been more cost effective to buy a really, really, really high-end digital camera. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I ended up doing. And so if I was shooting black and white, I would go back to film and shoot HP5. I think it's beautiful. But for color, it just makes a lot of sense now to shoot digitally.
Now, what's your approach to photography, or your teaching philosophy when it comes to teaching your students and what you want them to walk away with from your courses?
So, photography is a technical medium. So we have to talk about technical things, right? Like we have to talk about exposure, we have to talk about aperture settings and all of these kind of things. And especially since we're working digitally here, we have to also discuss things like the software that you use and printing digitally and all those things. And you have to teach those things, because without the technical part of it, you can't really get to the idea part of it, right? The picture has to look like what it is that you wanted to photograph in the first place.
Yeah, you have to know the rules before you break them.
Precisely, right? So I emphasize teaching the rules and making sure that people know those things really well and consider color and everything else. But if I'm being honest, I try to get past that pretty quickly. And the reason why I try to get past that really quickly is because I think that photography has a lot more to offer than just making something look good, right? I think that it's it's a medium that has all of these possibilities for meaning. And so very quickly, as soon as they learn the basic kind of technical things, I want to move on to, well, what are your pictures about? And that's the question that I ask everybody, right? What are your photographs about? Not what are they of, what is it about? What are you trying to tell someone through your images? And so that's my teaching philosophy is, yes, there has to be a good foundation, a good technical foundation, and skill-based foundation, but hopefully that leads you to getting past that as soon as possible so that you can just talk about, well, what is it that I want to say with my photographs, and how do I say that technically?
Is there anything you wish you were told when you were a student?
So yeah, there was a really interesting conversation that I had with a professor of mine at Columbia about failure. And he talked about the fact that photography is a medium where you have to be comfortable with failure, right? So you take a roll of film, and let's say if it's 35 millimeter, you have 36 pictures. You make 36 pictures, and out of those 36 pictures, maybe you get 2 or 3 images that are worth a damn, right? And so if you're not ready for that, like, you can't fix those pictures. You have to kind of learn by making them and by making mistakes. If you can't deal with that, the doubt that comes from that, if you can't deal with the failure that comes from that, it's really, really difficult to be a good photographer. And I wish someone had said that to me earlier, because I spent so much time, especially as an undergrad, questioning the validity of the pictures that I was making, because I was like, well, I'm making so many, but I don't have any good ones, or I aren't making enough good ones. And so that's something that I wish I had known. I had been kind of like just discussed. It's like, it's okay, you're gonna make crappy pictures. You're gonna make terrible pictures over and over and over again. You're gonna make the same picture a lot because you're trying to figure it out. And once you have that, once you understand that, it becomes really freeing, because then photography isn't about like, well, how many pictures did I make, or are they right, or are they good, or are they bad? But it's more about like, well, did I do these things in order to get the message across that I wanted to get the message to say in the first place?
So your advice to young photographers is you can't be afraid to fail. So
right. That's exactly right. Just go all out, like make a lot of pictures and make a lot of mistakes. And that's the fun of it too, is that you actually learn by shooting. So the other thing I tell my students is right off the bat is, if you want to know the secret of photography, and they go, yes, I want to know the secret of making good pictures. And I said, make a lot of bad ones.
Oh, that's good advice. So what do you think the test of a good photographer is do you believe that if they focus on one specific type of photography, like for example, if they focus on portraits, or they focus on deadpan photography or interiors, which I had no idea how hard interiors are to shoot, does that make them more successful? Would it help them make their mark as a good photographer?
I mean, it's a good question. I think I'm still trying to figure that out to some degree, but something that I will say is that and I want to make sure that I choose the right words, because I think it's kind of important to talk about that aspect of like what makes a picture good or not, like what makes somebody like work successful or not. You know, there are, I guess let's just say this, that one of the challenges now is that we can do so much so quickly, right? We can make hundreds of thousands of pictures. And even though I just said a moment ago, like, you should make as many bad pictures as you want, right? Or you should make as many pictures as possible. The other part of it is digital has also made it very, very easy to shoot indiscriminately and to shoot whatever, and anytime at any place.
Well, yeah, I worked as a portrait studio photographer. As soon as digital came around, job gone.
Yeah. I mean, it really changed things because you could just do so much, and it's easier, it's sort of simpler in some ways. So then the challenge, or something to really think about, is it's not so much about the subject, right? But it's about the thought behind the way that something is represented, at least in my opinion. And so the really good photographers, the people that I'm really, really excited about, there's usually a kind of economy in their practice, right? It's not about how many lenses you have or how many pictures you've made or who's famous or not famous, but it has to do with the kind of depth of their interest and attention to the subject that they're photographing and how they do that, right? So when I think about like issues of style or subject, and it's like, you know, I make portraits, but I also make landscapes. I make still lifes, but I also make you know, personal images, or I do this and that and the other. It's less about that than is like, what are we learning through your photographs, right? Are we just looking, or are we unpacking? Are we exploring? Like, those are the questions that I would ask of any photographer before I made a decision as to whether or not I like their work. Is like, am I learning something new, right? Am I being asked to really deeply think about the subject, or am I being just presented with something, right? And that's a big difference. And both people might make really competent, beautiful photographs, right? But one of them is asking more of the viewer, and the other one isn't necessarily. And so that's something that I think is more, should be considered more, is what are you telling someone about that subject, and less about the specifics of how you capture it in the first place.
Do you have a favorite photographer?
Yeah, I mean, I should grab a bunch of books from right here. So I have...
What are some of your favorite photo books?
Oh, okay. All right, I'll grab some. So in terms of some of my favorite photo books, you know, there's a couple here that I'll pull out that I look at quite a lot. And I mean, these guys end up being some of my favorite photographers, right? So, you know, John Gossage is one of those people whose books and photographs I look at a lot. One, because I think that they're incredibly deep and poetic works. The pictures are slow and kind of like there's a kind of meditation that's part of the work, right? There's this, but there's just also this larger sense of narrative that comes from the simplicity of the photographs, right? So that's someone, and if you know, this is John Gossage's The Pond, and I've been looking at this book for years and years and years, and I look at it constantly. It's one of the simplest books, and the simplest kind of concepts, but because of that simplicity and that kind of economy in their presentation, the work is all that much more deep in terms of meaning. Right? Like there's all of these things that are going on. So this book, you know, The Pond is it's literally a journey. Like we're walking around this pond, right? This sort of industrial pond somewhere, I believe it was outside of Washington, D.C. But the book is actually much more than that, right? It becomes about talking about the human condition. It becomes about, you know, the environment and the way that people treat the places around them. But it also works on ideas of transcendentalism, right? The idea of the pond, you know, by Thoreau. So there's all of these ideas about freedom and who we are as people, but represented by the simplest subject, which is literally a walk around an industrial pond, right? And the book beautifully ends in this picture here, which is of someone kind of entering a house and closing the door, right? And so it becomes also it ends up having this kind of point to make about like the world outside and how we kind of see it or protect ourselves from it or run away from it. There's all of these different layers to this book, and it's one of those books that I keep coming back to over and over again as a really, really good example of how photography can be directed at a particular subject, but actually be cast a much wider net of ideas. Another book that I look at a lot is Masahisa Fukase's Ravens, which also similarly, you know, it's all about the editing and the presentation of the images. So this is a Japanese photographer, and he's using these ravens, these pictures of ravens, and then pictures of kind of Japanese culture, right, as he kind of saw it, to speak about loneliness and the individual, right? So even though, again, it's the titular raven is part of the book, it really is about a singular point of view. So it's the subject, but the subject also encompasses and is a metaphor for other ideas about the human condition, about who we are as people. And so the book, you know, oscillates between these sort of beautiful and strange images of these birds and these sort of landscapes, and then more kind of contemporary life, you know, like degradation of life, you know, kind of the throwaway people that he was seeing right on the streets. And then it ends with this beautiful picture of this homeless person walking away, right? So, and in a way, we become that person, right? We become kind of estranged from the world. But that's done through the sequencing of images and the way that it kind of heightens this poetic sense of life in the book. It's one of my very, very favorite books. It's also really cinematic, right? Like there's pictures that blur out and kind of come back into focus. And it's an amazing book. It just got republished, reprinted. So if anybody's interested in a really kind of amazing book, The Ravens is one of them. I look a lot at In Flagrante by Chris Killip. So Chris Killip was photographing sort of northern England during the Thatcher years, sort of coal mining towns, right, that were being decimated. And so he was making this this project about the realities of the life of those people there during a really kind of really difficult economic situation. And that lined up a lot with what I was doing when I first saw this book, right? When I was working on all this stuff from Brooklyn. You know, black and white work again, really, really beautiful kind of pictures, but really touching, right? And really kind of personal images. And they oscillate again. He makes all kinds of different images, right? From sort of landscape pictures to portraits to groups. He photographs all of these things that were going on in and around these towns as they were kind of bearing the brunt of the new economic reality, right? As all these jobs were kind of closing. But it's about men and women and children, places, and it has one of my very favorite photographs, which I'm trying to find. But you see, like, I mean, they're just sort of these beautiful, incredible moments, despite the harshness.
It's such a powerful image. I love that.
Yeah, and even some of the protests that were going on and riots that were going on. All of those things are part of the telling of the story of this particular place at this particular time. I'm trying to see if I can find my favorite picture. But, like hauntingly beautiful book and difficult pictures, right? Of this place. And I may have skipped it. But let me see. I'm trying to see if I can find this picture because it's one of my very favorite pictures. I always go back to it. I always look at it. I always wish if I could make one picture like that, I'd be happy.
Your favorite photo?
I don't know if it's my favorite photo. I have a hard time choosing a favorite photo. But in this book in particular, that one photograph that I really like is like something that if I can ever make one photo like that, I think I'll die happy.
Oh.
Right? So it's just holds everything in there. I'm going to see if I can find it. I'm kind of missing it at the moment. Where is it? Where are you? I should just put like a thing on there.
Definitely put a post-it on there.
Here we go. Yeah. So like a picture like this, I think is kind of perfect, right? In a way,
it's stunning.
It's stunning. It's sort of sappy and romantic, right? This sort of beautiful young woman, beautifully lit on this couch playing with a puppy, right? The couch has this floral pattern.
The light on her face.
The weather outside, right? You can see the rain running on the window. So there's a kind of blurriness to the entire image. Like everything about this picture, although it's sort of a movie and a picture, right?
It absolutely is.
Yeah, everything about this picture in some ways feels like overly romantic, and yet it's so kind of heartfelt and telling and full of information, right? Both for like the look on her face and the kind of dejection and quiet desperation that's part of that moment, right? The playfulness of the puppy, like the wish that we could kind of have things be some other way. A couch with a floral pattern like that is all about a kind of desire, right? About like bringing in this beautiful world indoors, and yet it's kind of old and beaten up and doesn't quite have that sense of the garden, right, indoors that you would have. And then there's that little bit of light and weather that's coming from outside that tells you that outside is just as gloomy, right? Mm-hmm. There's something so perfect about this picture and so beautiful and so touching and so empathetic that it's one of those pictures that I constantly, I'm trying to make in some way, shape, or form, right? I'm trying to find that same kind of empathy and that same kind of beauty and some of the romanticism that's in the picture, especially in a lot of the black and white work that I was doing. So this was a big influence on me for a long time. And then, this book was recommended by one of my professors. It's called The Sweet Flypaper of Life by Roy de Carava and Langston Hughes. And it's one of these books that, it's it's a story by Langston Hughes, and then images by Roy de Carava, particularly images in Harlem. But the story and the pictures are not together. They don't illustrate each other, right? They don't but they fit together in this book in this really beautiful way. And it was made, I'm trying to remember if it was made in the 50s. I believe it was made in the 50s, the book, the original printing. Yeah, 1955. And so the book has some of the wildest layouts, right? Look at the pictures just kind of laid out in all these different shapes and sizes and scales and relationships.
Like a photo album.
Almost like a photo album.
Personal photo album that your family would have.
Yeah, it certainly has that feeling. And then throughout, there's this beautiful text of this woman who is about to die but doesn't want to leave because she cares about her family and she wants to make sure that they're okay. And so it's like a really touching, really amazing kind of book. But again, the text and the images don't play against each other. They kind of become connected in this really gorgeous kind of way. So this is another one of my favorite books. And then I've been looking a lot at Ron Jude's work over the last 5 years. His is color work, very, very quiet images, a lot like John Gossage's photographs, like really slow kind of burn photos, right? In this book, he's telling this, he's talking about the Salton Sea where he grew up, where he was a young man. And so there's these beautiful kind of slow, quiet moments and they're sort of poetic and desperate at the same time, but also really full of life and beautiful and sometimes really rough, right? And so his work I've been looking at a lot because of the use of color and yet sort of getting that same feeling that I get from these other books that I've been paying attention to for a really, really long time.
I want to thank you so much for letting us come into your space and chatting with us. This was amazing. I love your recommendations. So if you have any questions for Claudio or his courses or anything at all, please leave them down in a comment and we'll answer and get back to you. I'm also going to link his podcast that he was featured in. It was really, really good. I'll tag The Real Photo Show. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.